Thank you very much, Judy. That was an interesting and thoughtful presentation, and I do really appreciate. I can't imagine what it's like to be a parent of somebody with a personality disorder. And I think as a clinician who's trying to work with families, I think it's really important that in order to work out what families actually need and what families need to know, we actually need to walk in the shoes of the family. Now, I know that we've got some family members in here today with people with borderline personality disorder, but I'm also assuming that we've got some clinicians here. And I'm hoping that the introduction to my talk isn't going to be too triggering for the families here. But I would like to just stop and take you through a process of trying to imagine what it's like to be a parent of somebody with a personality disorder. Now, if you'd like to close your eyes, if that's helpful, or if you'd just like to pick a point that you can kind of focus on, that's fine. If you want to keep your eyes open, that's fine too. So imagine being a parent, a mother, a father, or maybe a brother or a sister of someone with a diagnosis of BPD. You've never heard of BPD before. You've never encountered anyone who self-harms before. You may have on occasion thought about suicide yourself, but you never really thought it would become a reality in your own family life. You've had some concerns for your family member for the past few years. You've noticed that her moods change rapidly. 1 minute she's withdrawn, and then the next minute she's angry, and the next minute she's really hostile and accusing you of things that you've never done. And then the next minute she's kind of just normal. And that feels like an absolute relief. You're aware that you're starting to monitor everything you say, everything you do, just in case you trigger something that's not okay for her. At times you actually feel anxious. You never quite know what it is that you're going to step into. You try to do helpful things, you try to be supportive, but you often get met with a lack of appreciation and possibly a whole lot more. You often get blamed and accused of not caring, despite going absolutely out of your way to care. At times you've tried to sit down and talk about things with your family member, but they become overwhelmed and upset and distressed, and it kind of shuts down the conversation really quickly. And they get overwhelmed and feel incredibly guilty, and this may actually lead on to further issues and problems such as further self-harm. So it actually feels like you can't even speak within your family life. You become increasingly aware that your loved one seems to really hate themselves. They often think about suicide. They seem tormented by their life in constant emotional agony. As time goes on, you become aware that they're hurting themselves in various ways, including scratching their wrists and at times cutting their arms and legs. You don't understand what is happening. You suggest getting help and they refuse. The behaviours start to escalate, and after a yelling match, your family member goes to their room. You leave them, but when you call them for dinner, they don't come. You enter into the room. She seems to be asleep. You try to rouse her, but she doesn't wake. You can't wake her at all. You're concerned. You start to notice that there's some empty pill bottles by her bed. So you ring an ambulance, and the next thing you know, she's admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And this seems to begin a long road of overdoses and increased severity to her self-harm and desperate attempts to access some sort of help, some answers. There is an increasing anxiety in you as a family member about whether your loved one will actually live or will they die. You never know what you're going to come home to. Will she be dead? Will she be bleeding? When she's not at home, she rings constantly, desperate and needing reassurance. But your reassurance doesn't seem to change anything. You find yourself watching her, not really wanting her to go out of your sight. You start to have sleepless nights. You start to withdraw from your own life. You feel tired, constantly on edge, fearful, and at times traumatized by the amount of blood and the possibility of death. You can't get certain images out of your mind. You don't know what to do. Services are sort of involved with your family member, but often will not. Your family member will often not even attend appointments, and services seem reluctant to talk to you. There's no one to talk to. Family and friends don't seem to understand. You don't understand. You start to wonder if you're to blame. Have you done something to cause this? If you had done something differently, would this have happened? You start to struggle with a wide range of emotions, including fear and anger, sadness, protectiveness, not caring at times, cutting off, and at other times feeling extremely traumatized. And you feel a great deal of grief about the loss of the daughter or the child that you thought you were going to have. And you don't know if you're ever going to get them back. You are fearful that you may lose the chance to get them back and that they may die. It's been my experience that families who actually are willing to engage with mental health services are doing the very, very best they can, and that they genuinely care for their loved ones. And what's more, they can be an asset, I think, to services. It's a pretty tough road. You know, we have families that have been going through these sorts of experiences for years and years. And it's different to what a clinician goes through. I mean, I think we often can sort of say that clinicians and families have some similar experiences with this client group. But families are there 24 hours a day, and they have a completely different emotional connection to their family member than a clinician, even though the clinician may really care and have a real connection with the client. The family's connection is very, very different. So I'm asking professionals to imagine it from a family's perspective. And I think as family members, we have to help them do that, because I think that they struggle. And I think there's all sorts of things that get in the way of that for clinicians. But I'm also today going to ask families to think about it from a service perspective as well. And I believe that if we can take into consideration both of these perspectives, both the family's perspective and the service perspective, that and we can improve the functioning relationships between the two, that we may actually have better outcomes for our clients. So let's think a little bit about the service perspective now. There's no doubt that services struggle to work with clients with borderline personality disorder. You know, often as a clinician myself, and I'm really passionate about my work, and I've been working at Spectrum for 13 years, that's got to say something. But even still today, now, you know, I can sit with a client and I can completely and utterly doubt my own ability. You know, I can feel absolutely hopeless, that I have nothing to offer. And at times, you know, even though I can mentalize and I can think about what might be happening for the client when they might become abusive towards me, or they might want to reject me, my ego still gets hurt, you know, as a clinician. It's really tough, you know, to have somebody who you've been seeing for a number of years turn around and say, well, you're fucking useless and I don't want to see you anymore, and you're a waste of time, really. It's really tough as a clinician when you're genuinely trying to help. So I think that, there is something that happened, and that's why we need supervision and support in doing the work, and we have to keep on thinking from the client's position. And we have to understand what triggers us and what our own vulnerabilities are. But it's bloody hard work, because there's something that's very personal about the relationship that we have with this client group that is quite triggering. They tap into our vulnerabilities. And, we're not perfect. So, and I often go home at the weekend on a Friday night, and I have a client in my mind, and I think, my God, what's going to happen over the weekend? What am I going to come back to? Are they going to be alive? Am I going to come back from, back to a number of phone calls from various services, police, the emergency department, families? What kind of mess am I going to actually have to kind of mop up again on Monday morning when I get to work? And I'm not going to necessarily even have the time to do it because I've got all these other clients to see. So there's a whole issue around that. And I think for a lot of clinicians, they're really, really fearful that they're going to get their knuckles rapped if they don't get it right. So if a client, if they're not doing a good enough job, or the client does die and they end up having to go to a coroner's hearing, that is a real fear for clinicians. And it's a tough one. And sometimes, I heard of a case just recently where a client took an overdose in hospital, and they didn't pick it up, really. And okay, that's not great. That's not great. But I also know that hospital is not a very safe place for this client group, because there's a little bit of a fantasy that hospital will keep this client group safe, and I don't know that they can, because the only person that can keep them safe is in fact themselves. And I heard that the nurses on the ward were getting a really, really tough time about it, and that actually then worked against them in wanting to work with people with a borderline personality disorder. So I think we get caught in a very, very tricky kind of position. The other thing that I wanted to say is that, and I don't think it's the same as a family's trauma, but to hear the stories and to hear about the self-harm, to hear about clients that have, in fact, got significant abuse histories and so on, is incredibly traumatising for clinicians as well. And I think it does make it difficult for them sometimes to then work with this client group. And we don't always have the answers. And I think one of the most important things, and I think that this principle applies to families as well, one of the most important things in working with this group sometimes is not falling into the trap of trying to make it better. That it's almost, one of the most important things is about kind of tolerating something of the emotional pain and not being overwhelmed by it. But that's a tough call, as we probably all know here. So I kind of think that my experience is similar, but not the same. And my experience, I suppose, with speaking with a number of family members and workers, is that there are a lot of parallels. We do have some common experience. And I think we need to actually use that common experience to try and improve services for families. And there are some other dilemmas, I think, for services in working with people with borderline personality disorder. Clients often don't want services to contact family members, and that really does pose a really tricky dilemma for workers, because their role is to engage and to align with the client. But in my mind, I keep on thinking that this has to be worked, because families are often the key supports. And if families don't know what's going on, they don't know what the left hand, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, it's actually not a very helpful kind of process, really. So we have to keep working that. And sometimes I think it's really important to actually be really clear with the client that you need to work with the family as well in order to work with them, especially when they're a primary support, you know. And it might be that the same clinician can't work with the family, that you have two different clinicians working with the client and the family. And that's how we work at Spectrum mostly. And that at times we might bring the family worker, the family, the client and their therapeutic person all in the room together. But it's quite a delicate process, and you know, sometimes families may not hear what they're wanting to hear, and they might need some preparation to actually be able to take on board what their family member might want to say. And the same goes the other way as well, that the client may hear something that they don't want to hear and may need some preparation and be prepared to hear something. You know, that families all getting together isn't necessarily going to make everything beautiful and wonderful. Sometimes it's about actually tolerating that we're not all going to necessarily see things the same way, and you may not get what you want from the other. You know, that works kind of both ways. I think one of the things that I've noticed sometimes in trying to work with the client and the family together is I get caught in a bit of a split. You know, so if I'm working with the client as my primary kind of person, you know, and I hear stories about the family, you know, I kind of align myself with the client, and that's actually really difficult then for me to engage with the family. And the same thing happens when I'm working with the family, and then I start to see the client as well. I find myself aligning with the first story that I've heard. And I think it's a really delicate balance. You know, sometimes we actually have to kind of hold something of both truths and recognise that there's all different perspectives and different truths and different stories that we need to actually hear. The other thing that I think that can happen is that families can avoid contact with mental health services for a variety of reasons. There's been many occasions when I think families have started to engage with me, and they've talked about how often they felt blamed by services. And there has been this kind of mantra about borderline personality disorder being associated with abuse. And there's no doubt that abuse does exist within, you know, within this diagnosis. But again, I just want to say that my experience is that families that want to engage are not the ones that are abusive. And but some stuff happens around that is really, really disturbing for me. And I think we actually have to be, as workers, we have to be really respectful, not to jump to all sorts of conclusions about what might be happening in the family. I recently saw a mother and a father with a client who was actually attending the Spectrum program. And initially, the father wouldn't attend at all. He just would not come. And when he did attend, I asked him how he was feeling. And he said, well, to be perfectly honest, I'm actually petrified that you're going to confront me and tell me for something that I actually haven't done. And as the story unfolded, he spoke about how a psychiatrist, in his wisdom, had asked him if he had abused his daughter. Even though he said no, the line of questioning continued, and he was given some psychoeducation about borderline personality disorder and its relationship to incest. He was horrified to believe that anyone could possibly conceive that he would do such atrocities to his daughter. He was outraged, and he actually started to believe that any time anyone looked at him from the health service, that they were convinced that he was having sex with his daughter. This sent him into a very, very deep depression and a desire to withdraw from the world. He became overwhelmed that the whole world thought of him capable of committing such a heinous crime. Another case also comes to mind. I'm currently working with a family who insist on locking up their 40-year-old daughter if they think that she's going to go out and self-harm, go out and buy blades or run in front of traffic. 40. They often hold a 24-hour watch over her at the times that they're concerned. The services, I initially started actually consulting to services around this case before I started seeing the family. They described the family as interfering, over-involved, enmeshed. And I think that the families start to feel really blamed, and they were really reluctant to work with services. I think that as clinicians, we sometimes forget the natural instincts of a parent, no matter how old the child is to protect and keep the child safe. We, the health professional, also seem to forget that there's a real possibility that their child may die on their watch. And their watch is often a 24-hour day. Confusion, I think, often occurs for parents and families that services don't actually take up a particularly protective stance when their loved one is presenting with some suicidal ideation. We might actually have a good reason for that. We might actually think it's in the therapeutic interest of the child not to necessarily be hospitalised. It's been my experience that hospital often results in even more dangerous behaviours. It creates major issues of feeling abandoned on discharge that can cause other problems. Often clients actually get into hospital expecting some TLC and some care and some time and some space, and they don't get it, and that disappointment is actually very, very triggering as well. So on the other hand, sometimes admissions can be used really therapeutically as well. So, but I think that clinicians are not very good at sitting down and talking about these issues. And what actually happens though is if we don't take up that protective role, then something happens for families where they feel like they have to take up that protective role. And if we don't think that that's necessarily going to be therapeutic, because I suppose part of what we're hoping to achieve or what we're hoping to work towards with this client group is that they take up something for themselves, that they learn to keep themselves safe. But to do that, and to ask families to step out, to find a way to be supportive, but not to be solely responsible for keeping their daughter alive or their son alive, we have to support families to do that. We can't just say it once. We've got to engage with families around that, because that is terrifying for a family member. That is terrifying, and it needs a lot of working. It's terrifying for clinicians. I don't know how many clinicians we've got in the room, but it's terrifying for clinicians as well. But even more terrifying for a family member. The other, I suppose, just thinking about working with families who've got a family member with borderline personality disorder. It is exhausting. It's really traumatic. And at times families really struggle to find a way to hold a boundary and to hold a limit. It's kind of like that, families and clinicians too, we get stuck in the same bind. You either jump in and you do too much, or you completely withdraw and just try and cut off. And sometimes it's really hard to find the balance. And it is something of a balance that I think that needs to actually be achieved for both families and clinicians. And but we have to be really careful not to judge what decisions families make. I worked with one family who actually ended up sending their child overseas to a program, and then they never actually provided the money for the airfare to bring them back. And it seems really, really harsh, but when you actually hear their story, it felt like that was the only way they could protect themselves, that they needed that geographical separation. And it was the only way that they could actually continue to actually have a relationship. So they continue to provide phone support and do the very best that they can do. But I think it's really important that we don't jump to all sorts of conclusions and judgments. Each family is different. Each case is different. So it's always interesting. I often write out my talk, and then I go off onto little tangents, and then I have to bring myself back to where I need to be. So the other thing that I think we need to also recognise as clinicians is that sometimes parents have their own histories of trauma and emotional difficulties. and that they too may suffer from a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, you know, or other mental illnesses. You know, they may struggle with drug and alcohol issues. You know, they may have struggled for all sorts of reasons that may have interfered with the attachment to their child. But we've got to work with this. We can't condemn them for this, because let's face it, we are all vulnerable, you know, in our lives to have people with mental illness or difficulties and problems. I have mental illness within my family, and it's a very difficult issue. So we're not just because we're clinicians doesn't mean that we're immune to this problem. I think the other thing to think about is that in order to support families, I think it's probably really important that we don't dwell on the past, that we actually find ways to move forward, to nourish the relationships in the here and now. The other concept that I did just want to talk a little bit about is this idea about families as a resource, because I think that this is really, really important. You know, the families that are here, you're the people that are around a lot of the time. And I think if we can support you in working out how to be in relationship with your child or your family member, that in itself is actually therapy, in my mind. You know, it goes a long, long way in my mind, and is really, really important. I think it's also really important that we actually support families to know what to do in a crisis as well, because often, you know, I think families are at a loss. So what do families need to know? They do need accurate information about diagnosis, services and treatments. We need to help them understand something of their loved one's experience. Help them recognise that their family members' struggles are actually real, and they may need long-term support, balanced with some realistic expectations about what's actually possible. Families will inevitably have questions about why their family member developed BPD. And this is a really tricky one, and in my mind there is no conclusive etiology. Really, we have some clues. We have all sorts of things that might be helpful. We do know that there is an enormous prevalence of abuse with people with BPD, but we also know that there are a number of people who've been sexually abused that have gone on to have normal lives, even when it's been a primary care person. You know, I think that there is something about attachment that's quite useful to think about. I worked again with a family. I was talking to somebody just before actually about this at lunchtime, and you know, they were a good middle-class caring family, you know, in good jobs, and their first daughter was kind of the perfect, you know, the perfect kind of child. She fitted into the family really well. They were very neat, you know, a little bit obsessional, a little bit like me really, and they had this kid who had a very slight intellectual disability. And she was a messy kid, and she just did not fit into that family, and they didn't quite know how to kind of manage it. So it was something really quite subtle, and that was only one way of understanding it. Maybe I'll, you know, in my way of trying to actually make sense of something, maybe I was completely off track too. Maybe that's not really what happened. You know, it's only one of my sort of hypotheses. You know, and some of my work with that family was about how to tolerate that child's difference. Their daughter's difference to them. But, you know, I don't think we really, really know. You know, we're guessing a lot of the time. I think, I think we need to allow a space for families to be able to speak of their experience without judging them. Don't assume that the family is dysfunctional. Remember that living with somebody with a borderline personality disorder can cause problematic dynamics within relationships. You know, so, you know, we don't know what was the egg and what was the chicken, really. I think that parents do sometimes behave in ways that aren't particularly helpful. But let me tell you, so do clinicians. And often the way families behave actually comes from a position of love and concern. And we need to think about that. I think we do need to support individuation as well as supporting relationships, healthier relationships between family members and people with borderline personality disorder. Often I think one of the hopes for treatment, or one of the ways to think about treatment, is helping somebody become a little bit more independent, having their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own desires. The problem is that for people with a borderline personality disorder, it's very easy to kind of step in and fill those gaps because the gap feels so intolerable for the person with BPD and for the people around them. And I think in order not to step in and fill those gaps, to allow the person to find a way to fill something of the gap, we have to, as clinicians and family members, step out. And I think that that's really, really difficult and really, really important. But the other part of this is families need permission to have a life. I think it's really, really vital. If I had a script pad, I'd say, have a life, go out on a date, be in relationship with your partner. So many relationships break down around, when there's a mental illness within the family. And I think especially when there's somebody with a borderline personality disorder. And it's really important that the relationship is actually nourished, the parental relationship or other types of relationships, including relationships with other children. Relationships need to be sustainable. And we need to support families, because if you keep on being there 100% of the time, it's not going to be sustainable. You're going to burn out. You're going to get sick. You're going to get tired yourself. I think we also need to not only accept that families are doing the best they can, we need to help families accept that their family member are often doing the very best that they can too. And that's a struggle. I know it's quite interesting, because when I see fathers and daughters, and this is a vast fathers and mothers, this is a vast generalisation, but sometimes what I actually notice is that the fathers kind of have this, well, just pull up your socks and get on with it kind of attitude, and that's a tricky one for their child to actually be able to hear. We need to work collaboratively with families. They are a valuable resource. The other thing I just would like to mention, that I do think that families sometimes do benefit from their own therapy and their own space. A space to think about you and how you're going to cope. We need more programs, I think, for families. We've just started running a one-day sort of psychoeducational program for families, and we're looking at also developing up an 8-week course next year based on acceptance and commitment therapy for families. So helping families identify their own family values and help them actually stay true to themselves. We need more services for families. So I just wanted to finish by saying families need to know about borderline personality disorder, and they need to know how to respond and to be in relationship with their loved ones. Families need to know about how the system works and why the system makes particular choices. Families need to know what to do in a crisis. Families need to know that they're entitled to a life. Families need to know that they're not alone. Families need to know that we are interested as health professionals. Families need to know that they will be heard and that we will try and understand their perspective. Families need to know that we will not blame them. Families need to know that we are there. Thank you.